First of all, I would like to share a reflection on the role of how do we represent the sustainable challenge, because there has been a lot of various representations. Just want to illustrate this because the way we represent a problem may be quite important the way we want to solve it. And then I would like to give you a short description of an approach of ecological economics as a way to appraise the biophysical dimension of economic processes. I was mentioning this morning that the economic processes in an evolutionary framework are multidimensional. So there are the biophysical dimension, the social cultural dimensions, the monetary dimensions, the psychological dimensions, a lot of dimensions interacting. And today or now, I just want to focus on the biophysical dimension and what ecological economic perspective has to bring into the debate. I'm very happy also that we have here an environmental economics that will provide a different perspective in the way that how the environmental issues can be integrated in the domain of economics, because ecological economic perspective is rather how to integrate the economic process within the ecological biocycles and processes. So without further introduction, I just go to the way we are addressing, or that this topic of sustainability is usually addressed, is to talk about those three main dimensions and imperatives: the ecological sphere, social cultural sphere, and economic sphere. And having these imperatives, we need ecological sustainability. We also are absolutely clear that social, cultural evolution and well-being for our discussion is crucial, and economic development. The thing is that how to articulate those imperatives while are given priority is sometimes very often problematic. This is the traditional representation that you probably all have seen once, and of course you know that in this representation sustainable development should be at the intersection between the natural, the human, and economic spheres or imperatives. Well, that's the way it has been presented in the 80s, 90s, and still sometimes it's presented, but of course there is a problem of how do those spheres are articulated. Is there something concretely and scientifically based that we can, for instance, distinguish between the human and the natural sphere? I mean, an ecologist would say, but how do you have something human which is not part of the natural environment? Maybe Thomas, as an anthropologist, would say, well, but how can you think that there are some economic activities that are not part of the social sphere? So what does it mean to have this kind of representation? And in addition, the question is, what is given priority? Are there human consideration given priority over ecological ones, or is it economic priorities that are really considered as crucial? This representation doesn't say much, and this is the reason why I call it particle representation, as if those different constraints and reflection were distinct, and we could address and say, well, ideally we should focus on alternatives that meet the three imperatives in the same time, which is a kind of idealistic representation and approach. In addition, there's another problem that even with this kind of representation that we very often see, is that empirically what happens is that an economic dimension or sphere takes more and more space through, as I mentioned prior, commodification, for instance. More resources are getting into the economic sphere or formal economic sphere. Do we really give the same kind of balance between those imperatives? This is far from being obvious. And the reason why I here show that the economic sphere is growing, it's also because of the dynamic and the specific rationality that is behind this. Is most of the time, and we can see that with the discussion about the corporates and transnational, that in the functions, in the way they functions, they subordinate ecological and social consideration under the need to expand, to be competitive, and to grow. This might be explained, and I tried to mention this at the previous session actually, that there is a capitalist requirement when you enter into a capitalization process. And let me just define not capital as something concretely defined. The capitalization process, which is the way you can enter in a capitalization process, such as a credit relation, or by engaging property, by engaging something as a collateral, that leads to the creation of money, and with this money you can invest. But if you can invest, you also have to face those imperatives that are to be solvent, and then if you have to be solvent, you have to be clear that all your activities are monetary assessed. So you need to assess labor in terms of money, you need to assess resources in the monetary counterpart. Profitability is a necessity when you have to pay interest or pay dividends, and competitiveness means that you have to be not only profitable, but more profitable than your competitors, otherwise you don't attract capital. Which also means that profitable activities might not be financed in this type of constraint. And then in order to face the time pressure for creating money out of your investment, you might find ways through growth, more activities, innovation, new activities to gain some market share. But in this specific rationale, that is a capitalist rationality, that is the business one, eco-social considerations are subordinated to capitalist requirement. And it's a double-bound situation. You cannot think of trying to prioritize environmental consideration, for instance, if you don't, at the same time, have a better competitive advantage compared to your competitor. Otherwise, you sort it out. Or if you want to change maybe the institutional conditions, but this is slightly different. Now, different representation. When we have a systemic representation with the economy being a sub-part of social construct in human activities or humanity in itself, as the human species being part of the natural environment, we have a quite different representation. And in this representation, well, the human activities depends on the natural environment, both for the own survival of the species, but also in terms of accessing resources that are available or not in the local or not so local environment. And also economic activity, human activities are affecting, of course, the natural environment. So this is the basic dialectical relation, human-nature interaction that are permanent. And also, what is also very important is that very often they enter into a causation of circular effect, that you change the environment, the change of the environment will define what is new possibility, but also new constraint. Depending on these new constraint, you might again change the environment. That is the cumulative nature of, for instance, CO2 emission. When it's too hot in the city and you use your air conditioning, you're just adding the CO2 in the atmosphere and just adding cumulative effect on the process. Economic activities depends on human consideration, different kind of criteria for selecting among different alternatives, options. What are the, we can call it cultural selection criteria. If it's profit, if it's human-centered economics, we are going to talk about well-being, different kind of quality of life indicators, which are quite different, but it's absolutely important to see how human consideration will orientate economic activities. And also, economic activities depend on the natural resources and also the natural capacity to assimilate a different type of waste. So in that representation, because of the systemic representation, the systemic hierarchy is quite different, because if we don't have a viable environment, there is no human species and there is no economic activity. So ecological integrity comes as a first type of constraint. And human well-being is the purpose of human activities to at least, and this is again focusing more on the biophysical dimension, human well-being in terms of what type of resources are mobilized, but in order to have a final purpose that is serving the human actors, member of society, with a lot of distributive impact, etc. Economic efficiency still remains an important element, because we cannot waste any type of resources, but the way we balance between means and ends may be interesting. It's not only for devoting all the resources for the sake of growth. We can think that we might reduce the use of resources because we have other considerations to take into account. Means and ends can be balanced. In that case, the systemic hierarchy where economic activities are in a way subordinated to eco-social imperatives in order to maintain the sustainability of the environment, but also the kind of social conditions that are for the sake of most people, hopefully. I just go because I want to show now the contribution of ecological economics focusing on the biophysical dimension. So it's the relation between the ecological context and economic processes. The main element is that, well, we look at the interaction, focusing on biophysical dimension, and there is an element of qualitative change in the entropic nature of the use of resources. Resources have not the same quality than the waste, and we cannot use the waste in the same way we use resources. So there is a qualitative change. And there are qualitative differences in the resource. That's something I'm going to address in a few minutes. Kind of instrument to have a better idea of what these exchanges are, balance of energy, material, and matter, the social metabolism approach, impact assessment, life cycle analysis. These are kind of instruments and tools that are specific to trying to integrate or to apprehend the biophysical dimension of economic activities and processes. Just a few research areas. I don't want to extend, but these are just to show that there's a lot of people working on this and on other type of academic research network that can be also very important partners for us in the term that there are a lot of people working on economic alternatives. Important difference, I mentioned the difference that are economic and ecological difference of resources, and I used the stock and funds differentiation that was proposed by Joseph Rogan, just an idea that a stock such as a barrel of oil provide a flow of energy matter, but you use it and, well, there is not anymore of this stock. This part of it has disappeared and it's in the environment in another state, of course. Funds such as a biosphere or lake or forest is interesting because also it provides some flow of matter energy, but in a limited amount of time, in a limited amount, and also this amount is depending about the regenerative capacity of the fund. So what is interesting is that with the funds, you can have something that is potentially sustainable. As long as you respect the regenerative capacity of the fund, you can have a forest. If you keep the regenerative capacity of the forest, you can use a certain amount of wood, which is not the case, of course, for a barrel of oil. You use it, you lose it. So sustainable use for biotic resources is possible with limitation, but sustainable use in terms of renewability of mineral resources of fossil fuels is not. And this is something that the debate in the 80s tried to evade, saying, well, there are substitutability. But the thing is, if you look at the ecological or biophysical dimension, this is not the same type of process. But on the contrary, what is interesting is the economic potential that to fuel some exponential growth. You cannot fuel exponential growth based on funds because there are limitations. Seasonal availability, discontinuities, limited amount of quantity. You cannot fuel an exponential growth process, while you can do that with mineral resources and fossil fuels. So that's, but only for a limited historical time and with environmental degradation. But it's still possible for at least a few decades to focus on this type of resources and to mobilize those potential and the power that is available in continuity for the economic system, which is a great advantage for the economic system and actors. So, just to mention that ecological economics has also a lot of alternative approaches and practices. First of all, the focus is on how to reduce the throughput, so the flow of matter energies that enter into the economic process. Efficiency, and not only monetary efficiency, but biophysical efficiency, and then reuse, reduce, recycle, recover, recolonization of activities. The circular economy concept, which is how to mobilize the waste in terms of that could be some, again, invested in the circle. And since there is an entropic degradation, it's not the same kind of resources, so it's more about downcycling than recycling. Industrial ecology, how to mobilize different actors and activities in a system to be more effective in the way we use those resources. Agrobiology. Functional economy is the way, instead of focusing on who is the owner, it's what are the needs and how the use can be organized differently in terms of, instead of only wanting to be the owner, but how to optimize the use of the resources. Sufficiency economy is how to manage the different resources in order to have sufficient amount of food and shelter and material things without focusing on absolutely growing consumerism that was mentioned. Then the problem is that there are a lot of approaches and practices, but in practice they are always focusing or face the obstacles that we still are in this capitalist industrial complex when the selective criteria are focusing on what is, can you really provide growth, profits, and if you don't, you are facing a real problem in trying to attract capital. And most of my colleagues working on ecology, on industrial ecology, face the problem of not having access to capital if they are not profitable. So the criteria of being profitable is still pervasive. For us, thinking of how to change from a kind of dynamics where our eco-social considerations are subordinated to capitalist requirement of solvency, profitability, growth, we need what I call normative hierarchy inversion. So it means that we need to have economic activities that are subordinated to eco-social consideration, which include indicators for, well, the quality of life, which include some ecological standards that frame the private activity. So that's at the general level, at governance level, and we can, of course, talk about how to do this. This is exactly the reason why we're here. But there is, importantly, a difference in the way we select options and alternatives, the different type of criteria. Then as a conclusion, so the way we represent the sustainability issues is quite important. It might really change the way we think of alternatives and policy to implement them. There is ecological economics is focusing on the biophysical dimension of economic processes. It shows the entropic nature of economic process. And there also a difference, ecological and economic differences of resources, especially between biotic and mineral resources. There are a lot of alternative technology and practices, it was mentioned already, that exist. But the problem very often is that the capitalist selection criteria still dominate and discriminate some of those existing technology. A shift in the normative hierarchy is required, but also a change in the way we fix the boundary between private cost and social cost. That was mentioned today as well. Institutional conditions, regulation, fix the boundary between what you are supposed to pay, to what cost you are obliged to bear, and what benefits you can get. But also it means that in a competitive process, it's an incentive to shift costs from the private cost to the social cost. So when we talk about externalities, we have to not to forget that the institutional conditions that fix the legal obligation, it's also an incentive to shift the private cost to the society or to the environment, because you are in the position of limiting your own costs, and that if you don't do it, your competitors will do them. So in this kind of rationale, as Gary was mentioning this morning, it's the way we look at the way the enterprise is defining what is efficiency. If we look at the enterprise side of view, it creates this cost-shifting process, which is quite problematic. It's more than externality. It's how to say, pressure for externalizing costs. So thank you very much for your attention.